Greetings and salutations, friends and gamers of all stripes. My name is GM Dave. I am your man behind the screen, and welcome back to our System Showcase revisit of Savage Worlds. Today's topic is character creation for Savage Worlds, which we'll approach by examining a character sheet for the game's Deadlands Reloaded setting. Yes, friends and gamers, this means visual aids are present, so you'll want to pay attention to your screens, especially if you've never played Savage Worlds before. Before we get started though, I would like to apologize for the lateness of this video. The recent move we've made at my workplace, on top of some smaller but no less impactful life events, forced me to delay this video for quite a bit longer than I would have liked. But that's enough preamble. You've waited long enough to get into this, so let's go ahead and start by taking a look at the sheet and diving right into the step-by-step process of character creation. Okay, so I know I just said that was enough preamble, but before we start picking through the sheet, I would like to note that this particular sheet, as well as many others, are available to download for free in both fillable and non-fillable PDF format from Pinnacle Entertainment's online store. Secondly, I'd like to draw your attention to the Savage Worlds logo in the upper right corner here, specifically the subtitle underneath. As you can see, this sheet is from the Savage Worlds Adventure Edition, the latest edition of the game. However, I want to note that the book I'm referencing is the Deluxe Explorers Edition, which is a little bit older. For the overwhelming majority of what we're going to be doing here, it's not going to make a difference, but there are a couple of details that we'll touch on later which are missing from this sheet, but present on older edition sheets. And as for why I don't demonstrate this using the Explorers Edition PDF sheet that I have for Deadlands, well, I'll just let you have a look for yourself. As you can see, the layout itself is perfectly fine, it is serviceable, but all these little extra assets that are meant to give it that sort of Western look and feel to help, I guess, up the immersion, really end up just being much more distracting. And not only that, they leave the sheet feeling both messy and cluttered. Some of these details can even make important information that you need a little bit difficult to read. In particular, these little bullet hole markers where they would have you put the die roll for your attributes. Moving back onto the sheet we will be using, overall we can see this one is pretty standard. Here in the top left, you have your attributes with your skills directly below that. Next to that in the top center are your character details, followed by your pace and defensive stats below that, then a space for your gear list. The right-hand side features your hindrances, then edges and advances. I will admit this is one segment of the character sheet that I'm not particularly wild about, since it pre-notes where you'd put edges of a specific rank, but we're going to dig into that detail soon enough. Scrolling further down, we get to our two sections for combat info, powers and weapons. On the right side border of the sheet, we have a wounds and exhaustion tracker, which is very helpful, and the bottom features an ammunition tracker. As we saw earlier, the older sheet had a similar ammunition tracker, but given that it took up the entire left-hand side of the sheet, it ended up taking up considerably more space. Now let's head back to the top of the page and start looking at our first aspect of character creation and the first difference with this newer sheet versus the older ones. While I'm at it, I may as well clarify now why I'm opting to use the newer sheet instead of the older one beyond just the clutter issue. And it's primarily because of this you can see right here. If you look at the area I've highlighted in the attributes section, you'll see this sheet lists your die progression in order from lowest to highest. Personally, I find understanding how to progress your dice as stats and skills is pretty easy, but I've got a few years experience under my belt, and I've seen firsthand how it can be a little tricky for some players who've never experienced a stat system that replaces static numbers with dice to wrap their head around this. Thus, for the sake of the visual aid, I've opted for this newer sheet, so you can see right here exactly how the lowest to highest die scale works for determining your stats. But back to actual character creation, the Deluxe Explorers Edition suggests starting this process by selecting your race from the ones your GM has made available. Humans are usually the most common, but depending on the game, they may or may not be available. However, you probably noticed that your character details section doesn't have a specific section for race on this sheet, but instead has spaces for your nickname and your character's conviction. Conviction is a mechanic specific to the Adventure Edition, one which we aren't using. So we're just going to cross that out for now, and we'll assign something else to that later. Nickname we're also going to cross out, as we'll make this our section for race. Once you've selected your race from the ones available, you want to jot down how that race affects your skills, attributes, defensive stats, edges, and so forth. Do note that if you are actually doing this for Deadlands, humans are going to be, by default, your only available race unless your GM has decided to change that. From here, we then move on to our traits. Traits are the catch-all term for all of our stats, which means that our attributes, skills, and derived stats, including our defensive stats, are all considered traits. The first section we look at in traits is the first on the sheet, the attributes. These are our primary stats in the game. As you can see, Savage Worlds only has 5 attributes as opposed to the 6 from D20 system games like D&D or Pathfinder. These attributes are Agility, which measures your hero's nimbleness, quickness, and dexterity. It's also tied with Smarts as the attribute with the most skills tied to it, totaling 10. Moving on, we then get to Smarts, which measures your intellect, including how well you're able to think on your feet, how quick thinking you are, and your understanding of things such as history, culture, and language. Spirit indicates your wisdom and willpower and holds particular importance for your character as it's going to help you recover from the shaken status, which is the status that you incur before you start accruing wounds. Strength is exactly what it sounds like. It's your raw physical power and your general fitness. Strength has a direct effect on how much damage you do in hand-to-hand combat. Lastly, Vigor covers your endurance, resistance to disease, poisons, and toxins, and directly impacts how much damage you can shake off by helping to determine your toughness score. Unless affected by your race, every character starts with a D4 in these attributes and is then given 5 points with which to raise them. Raising a die by 1 step, for example from a D4 to a D6, will cost you 1 point. You may spend these points however you want, with one exception. No attribute may be raised above a D12 during character creation. Once your attributes are determined, you can move on to your skills. As you can see, these two are directly tied to specific dice and are raised in a manner similar to your attributes. However, there are 2 key differences here. 1, you have a lot more skills to choose from, and so you get more points to spend. And 2, raising skills to a die that is above that of their linked attribute is going to cost you more points. To be exact with this, you're going to start off with a total of 15 points to spend across your various skills. Just like with attributes, these cost 1 point per increase, and you may spend these however you like, with no skill being able to be raised above a D12. However, this is the important distinction. You can raise your skills above their linked attributes by spending 2 points per die beyond that point. For example, let's look at the fighting skill, which covers your hand-to-hand combat capabilities. Fighting is tied to agility. Let's say you spent 2 points in your agility, making it a D8. Starting at D4, you spend 1 for D6, and then 1 more for D8. This means each increase for your fighting will cost 1 point until it also reaches a D8. But what if you want to start with a fighting of D12? The good news is you can do this. The bad news is that since it's going to be higher than your agility, each increase now costs 2 points instead of 1. Which means moving up to D10 will cost you 2 points, and then again to D12, another 2 points. Now then, we reach our derived statistics, and the second point at which this character sheet differs from the older ones. As you can see, the Adventure Edition features 3 derived stats: pace, parry, and toughness. However, the Explorer's Edition also includes the derived stat of Charisma, which is probably the easiest of the derived stats to work out, except maybe for pace. These stats should be the last thing you fill out on this sheet, excluding gear, because all of these are going to be, just as their name suggests, derived from a number of sources. Your attributes, skills, edges, hindrances, and chosen race can all have an effect on the final values of these stats. But what about the base values? Let's have a look. Starting with pace, every character begins with a pace of 6 at base. Remember, that's measured in inches if you're using a proper battle map. If you aren't, then pace does become a bit less impactful, but I'd suggest keeping in mind which characters are faster or slower based on their chosen race, hindrances, or edges. You could even potentially use race to kind of affect how initiative works, although I wouldn't recommend it. I've experimented with this using Theater of the Mind play, and it doesn't really work all that well. Maybe you'll have better luck than I did, though. Generally speaking, though, in Theater of the Mind, I tend to allow pace to just sort of determine how quickly someone is going to reach a goal or reach an enemy in abstract. Next up, we have parry. For those of you coming from D&D and similar D20 system games, parry is your equivalent to AC for melee combat. Yes, you heard that correctly. For melee combat, and only melee combat. Recall how in the basics video that I mentioned that your target number for success in most cases is going to be 4? Melee combat is one of the exceptions to that rule, with your character's fighting rolls being made instead against the target's parry. Appropriately, parry itself is derived from your fighting skill, equaling 2 plus half your total fighting. For example, if your fighting is 1d4, your parry is 4. 2 plus 2. Half of 4 is 2. If it's 1d6, your parry is 5. 2 plus 3. Half of 6 is 3. So on and so forth. Toughness then represents your damage threshold, and that is calculated similarly to parry. 2 plus half of your vigor attribute. Toughness is the score you roll damage against to wound your enemies. Meter exceeded and the target becomes shaken and could start moving up the wounds tracker, which we'll explore in greater detail when we cover the combat video. Lastly, we have the one that doesn't appear on this sheet, Charisma. Charisma is nice and easy because literally everyone starts at the exact same value, 0. Your Charisma score will then raise or lower based on your chosen hindrances or edges. Now, in rare cases, it can also be affected by your chosen race, but at least in the core book, none of the races that I saw available there had any kind of impact on their charisma. As for what your charisma score does, well, it has a direct impact on the persuasion skill, adding a bonus or inferring a penalty depending on what your score is. It can also have an impact on the first impression that your character makes towards different NPCs, be they hostile or non-hostile. Although, generally speaking, a hostile NPC is much more likely to shoot first and ask question later anyway. And finally, we reach the final sections of the character sheet, or at least the half of the sheet that's the quickest to explain. Hindrances, edges, and gears are all pretty self-explanatory. Simply jot down your selections and maybe include the book and page number where the particular choice shows up so you can easily reference it later if you need to. That said, recall how I mentioned earlier that the edges section on this sheet pre-marks edges of a specific rank? That's what these different letters on the left-hand side stand for. N for novice rank, S for seasoned, V for veteran, H for heroic, and L for legendary. These ranks are key to Savage Worlds' leveling system, which we'll get into in a future video. However, I personally find that assigning these slots ahead of time is pretty annoying. It assumes the number of edges you're going to take at different levels and of different ranks. For myself, I would much rather these have just been left entirely blank, just the simple, basic blank line so that the players can fill out for themselves what edges of what ranks they're getting and not have to deal with having a portion of that space taken away by a letter that denotes that for them when they might not even be making that choice. Moving on from hindrances, edges, and gear, we come to our final sections, powers and weapons. Each of these sections notes the relevant info you'll need as a player to make proper use of these in individual columns, though the way this sheet is designed makes these columns themselves very difficult to see. If you look really closely, you can see them there. The sections that you fill in are slightly different color from the background section, which is how it's sort of laid out. But if that little fill section wasn't there, you wouldn't even be able to see it. For powers, you'll need to know what the power is. Its PowerPoint cost in the section marked PP, get your mind out of the gutter. Its range, duration, and effects, which will include any damage that it deals. Note that because the effects section is so small, you're probably going to want an extra sheet to note anything extra derived from your power's trappings. Similarly, the weapons section has you note what the weapon is, its range, damage, armor piercing value under AP, rate of fire value under rate of fire, weight, and any extra notes you're going to need to keep track of. We'll get into deeper detail about what all of these things mean, both in terms of powers and weapons, when we both look at combat and take our dedicated look at powers later on in this series. And just like that, we've covered the entirety of the character sheet. So what about the process of character creation itself? Well, Savage Worlds provides a character creation summary, which I will both put on the screen here and pin in a comment down below for all of you. But while it's pretty solid, I personally don't think that it is set up to be the best order it possibly could be. So let me go ahead and show you my preferred order of operations. So just as the summary suggests, we are going to start by selecting our race as relevant to the setting. Again, since Deadlands is an alternate history version of post-Civil War America, our only choice here is going to be human, but there are plenty of other settings that can and will allow for different races. Once our race is chosen, we then move on to the 5 attributes. Remember that all of these start at 1d4 and we have 5 points to spend. We also cannot raise any of these above 1d12 at character creation. Don't forget to include any relevant bonuses from your race here too. Continuing to keep in line with the summary, we then move on to our skills, where we have 15 points to spend on our choices. Once again, remember that all of these start at 1d4. Do not forget that they cannot be boosted above 1d12 at character creation, and also remember to add any racial bonuses you may get. Also remember there's a cost increase for moving above a skills linked attribute. Skills cost 1 point up to the die value of the attribute, and then 2 points for each die value above it. Finally, it's at this point where we're going to break away from the suggested order of the summary. The core book here suggests that we should start by working on our derived stats, but remember what was said when we touched on that section earlier? Your derived stats get their values not just from your attributes and skills, but also hindrances and edges. But we haven't taken any hindrances and edges yet, so what sense does it make to fill out the derived stats now? None. The answer is none. It makes no sense at all. So we're going to skip this part and move into what really should be the next step, which is choosing our hindrances. Now, while this isn't a requirement, all players are very much encouraged to pick 3 hindrances at character creation, 1 major and 2 minor. These are going to give you a small pool of extra points to spend on character creation. You get 2 points for selecting the major hindrances and 1 point for each of the 2 minor hindrances. However, do note that while you're allowed to select more than the suggested 1 major and 2 minor hindrances, you will not gain any extra points for doing so. Additionally, the only way to get the full extra points is to select both major and minor hindrances. 2 major hindrances or 4 minor hindrances will not give the benefit of the full 1 major, 2 minor selection. Now, once you've chosen your hindrances, we can then use these points to either buy additional increases for our attributes and skills, or you may use these to spend on edges. Increasing attributes and buying edges both cost 2 points each, while skills only cost 1. Note that if you use these points to buy skills, they are not affected by the cost increase for raising a skill die above its associated attribute. Touching on that fighting example from earlier, let's say you're at a D10 and you want to use one of these points to increase it to a D12. Bully for you, doing that this way only costs 1 point. Additionally, you can also spend 1 point to gain extra starting funds equal to what your original starting funds were. So if, for example, the setting you're playing in starts you with the $500 that the core rulebook suggests, which is going to be the rule for most settings, if you spend, say, 2 points on extra money, those 2 points are going to net you an extra $500 each to spend, totaling $1,500 at the start. Naturally there, though, the sacrifice is that you're giving up on either skills, attribute increases, or the powerful edges. And with those points spent, Now that our attributes, skills, hindrances, and edges are officially finalized, we can finally fill in our derived stats, remembering to include any and all bonuses and penalties from our race, edges, and hindrances. From there, it's simply a matter of buying our equipment and finalizing any background details about our character, and there you have it. Our character is complete. I hope this video has been helpful to you, friends and gamers, especially those of you who are looking to get into Savage Worlds for the first time. I'd also like to apologize once again for the delay in getting this video released. The initial hope and plan was to have this recorded and ready to go within 1 to 2 weeks of the basics video, but as mentioned earlier, a couple of small hiccups in my day-to-day, as well as the rather large one that came in the form of moving to the new store for work, while remaining open for business the entire time, and no, we're still not done setting the place up, almost a full week and a half later, slowed things down pretty considerably for me. However, the skies, and more importantly my schedule, are looking quite clear ahead, so I should be able to get right back on track to have the combat breakdown out for you within the next 2 weeks. Until that time, please remember to like this video if you found it useful and enjoyable, and leave a comment below with any thoughts or questions that you might have. If you found this content helpful and would like to see more, feel free to subscribe, and make sure to open the description box below to follow me on my social media presences. While you're down there, you will also find a link to Phoenix Rising, my fantasy adventure webcomic, which I post monthly on Webtoon. If the idea of classic fantasy adventure with a touch of intrigue, romance, and a whole lot of heart appeals to you, please give it a read. I'm certain you'll find it enjoyable. And with that said and done, friends and gamers of all stripes, remember that in the world of tabletop games, you don't want to just sit back and watch, but get in there and game.